Okay, well, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm really grateful for the panelists, and I'm grateful for the audience and the attendees for joining us at this time. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the first session of webinar of our series, Decolonizing African Cinema History. I will be very brief, is that I'm really happy that this conversation that started with June Giovanni almost a year ago that now come to fruition in this collaboration between June Giovanni's Pan-African Cinema Archive and the Africa Institute. I have known June for many, many years, since even prior to Africa 95 when we met, and I think I met you, June, and Emro at this famous conference, foundational actually conference on African cinema in 1995 as part of Africa 95, and it's really a pleasure to reconnect again. This program is not meant to be comprehensive but selective because, of course, when we say African cinema, it's really broad. We're talking about a whole tradition within more than 55 countries, and you're talking also about the diaspora abroad, wherever Africans are. So Africa is this global presence. So we have been selective, and I'm grateful to Imro and June for designing a very precise thematic program that also pays attention to history, but also pays attention to the complexity of Africa as a category in and of itself, or a concept, but also realizing that the cinema or history of cinema in Africa is not even. We know that it's in North Africa, in Egypt specifically, another North African country, or in South Africa. It has a longer history than other places in West Africa and East Africa and so forth. So there is that balance between all of these elements. I also want to say that it has not been easy to obtain. It is still a problem, and I'm grateful to June Giovanni's archives for that, is that it's not been easy a process to really get permission. And in many cases, we had some difficulties getting some of the films that we wish for because of difficulties of distribution, which is still a problem that we hope at some point this will be one of the themes that we'll discuss. So without any delay, really, I just wanted to thank June and Imro for designing such a beautiful program that actually reads, and it is actually almost like a course, a foundational course in African cinema. I'm grateful to the moderator today, Gaston Kabori, who is a legend within African cinema itself. I have not had the pleasure of meeting him, but I've always taught his work and his writings. I'm also grateful to dear friend and colleague, Professor Mamadou Dio and Professor Lindiwe Edovi for joining us as discussant. And I will stop here, just ending by thanking the staff of the Africa Institute, Satan Al-Hassan specifically, who is the head of our programming, research, and publication, for the amazing work that he has been doing for the Africa Institute and also in relation to this program. I'm also grateful to Rima Al-Badawi and to our technical team, Sharif and Vijay, among others, and also grateful to all the attendees. So I'll take it on, Satan.
Thank you, Salah. Thank you very much. Well, I also wanted to echo Dr. Salah by saying thank you to the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive, June Giovanni herself, and Imru for collaborating on this wonderful program, and to all the speakers and the moderator. I will leave the introductions to the co-organizers, but I wanted to give some information about the program. The program is set to take place over 4 weeks, with films made available to screen through the Africa Institute website 3 days before each webinar session. Today's session is titled Foundations of African Cinema, and is the first in a series of 4 sessions. We had 3 films available for screening as part of this week's session. Afrique sur scène, which is directed by Pauline Vieira, The Adventurer's Return by Mustafa Al-Hassan, and Yusuf Shaheen's Al-Ard, or The Land. The webinar will last for about 1.5 to 2 hours. It will include 10 to 15 minutes of presentations by each guest speaker before turning into a discussion. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So for everyone attending, please write your questions in the Q&A section, and we hope to answer all your questions. So I would like to thank the staff of the Africa Institute for making this happen and for organizing this, specifically Reem Al-Badawi. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank all the distributors and the rights holders for allowing us to screen the films. I'll pass it on to June and Imru. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you both, Salah and Satan, and I must say Reem, because your staff have been the ones that we've had most of the connection and the coordination with, and it's a pleasure to be working with you. We're very glad to have this connection, and yes, welcome to everybody from the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. We call it JG Packer sometimes because it's quite a mouthful. But I'd first like to make an introduction by talking about the overall rationale for this webinar series. So the African Institute in Sharjah, UAE, in collaboration with us, is presenting this film symposium program entitled Decolonizing Cinema Archive, Decolonizing African Cinema, a History. And the JG Packer welcomes this partnership as part of our vision, which is to help to inform ongoing debates and activity concerning the value and the use of audiovisual archives, particularly in relation to the study and curation of African cinema. In this regard, we place a high value on deepening the archive's links with an institution such as the Africa Institute, and with students of African cinema generally, and particularly on the continent of Africa. This webinar program aims to reconsider the factors that have shaped the foundations of African ideas about cinema, and to situate the seminal works in African cinema in relation to contemporary films and the trends and tendencies which have defined debates and critical ideas around this cinema. So the purpose and the structure of this series is structured around four, you've heard it's structured around four webinar symposiums, and each will focus on a theme to be explored by a number of discussants. And you also know that each webinar will be accompanied by a series of films, both essential and recommended viewing. And the topic of each symposium is intended to frame a cluster of ideas around which a discussion will be based, and a critical framework eventually established for conceptualizing new perspectives on the foundations on which African cinema exists today and their significance for contemporary and continuing debates. I should have, at the beginning, mentioned that there are two of us here representing the JG Packer, the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive, myself a director, but also Imru Bakari, a senior lecturer, a filmmaker, and somebody who has been a stalwart support for the development of this archive. And I'd like to hand over to him now to also say something by way of the introduction that we have in mind.
Thank you, June. Thank you, Salah. Thank you, Satan, and the team at the Africa Institute. And again, welcome to all the participants of this series or today's symposium, and I hope you will be throughout the whole series. Decolonizing African Cinema, a History. As has been stated already, we are aiming these symposia at a wide and diverse audience. We are giving we've given specific consideration to students of African cinema, and of course, with a focus on the African continent, where we are very aware of, in terms of our work over the years, over the decades, the lack of knowledge and resources for the study of African cinema in Africa as a whole. The overall aims of the program, again, just expanding a little bit on what's been said, in recognizing these debates that are ongoing and the current moment which we are in, we as curators, as organizers, feel there's a need to reframe contemporary debates with a view, in fact, to opening up the field to new perspectives, which prioritize issues pertinent to Africa's cultural economy and its futures. I think this is very important. And we hope we can achieve some of this over the 4 discussions. The panelists have generally been invited to consider the factors that have shaped the foundations of African cinema, its ideas, and of course, to situate these ideas within the various contemporary histories and interventions and trends that we observe. Reference has been made to the selection of films which accompany each symposium. Today's symposium, we've already noted it. And of course, we note the significance of exploring the significance of the past in the moment of the present with its various intersections, its connections, continuities, and discontinuities. Today, we are speaking particularly around the idea of the foundations of African cinema. The second symposium will be Cinema Cultures in Africa. The third one will be Historicizing the Decolonial Principle, Decolonizing Principle, and the fourth will be Continuity and Change. The films which have been provided for screening online, Satan has mentioned these already. The discussants may or may not directly refer to these films, but they are intended to provide an indication of the scope of the film subjects, the themes, the ideas, and indeed the styles that might inform some of the discussions, or maybe all of the discussions which we hope to have across the next 4 weeks or so. We envisage, as Satan has said, the webinar session will be about 90 minutes. Each moderator will have, and the moderator and the panels will have about 10-15 minutes to make the introductions and presentations. And then, of course, we'll be followed by a discussion among the panelists, opening it out to questions and comments from our audience. And I will say again, your presence and participation is most welcomed and very much appreciated. And now June will introduce Gaston Kabore, and we will move into the first discussion.
Hi, everyone.
Yes, sorry, I thought, yeah, okay.
Sorry. Yes, I will introduce Gaston, and I will introduce the other 2 speakers. Okay, Gaston Kabore, apart from being a great friend and somebody who I know from 1983, when he came to London to participate in the Third Eye Film Festival that we had organized on around Third Cinema in London. I was the coordinator of that festival, and Gaston was one of the guests, and we've been colleagues since then. And I came to Burkina Faso to FESPACO a couple of years later in 1985. Gaston is a film director from Burkina Faso. He trained as a cinematographer in Paris at the École Supérieure d'Études Cinematographiques and completed a degree in history at the Sorbonne University. He served as the Secretary General of the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, FEPACI, from 1985 to 1997. In addition to numerous documentaries, his films include the features Wend Kuni, God's Gift, 1982, winner of the Silver Tannet at Carthage Film Festival, and winner of the César Award for Best French Language Film in 1985. Zanboko, 1988, winner of the Silver Tannet, again at Carthage, and Rabi, 1992, which has won the jury prize at Carthage in 1992 and was shown at the New York African Film Festival in 1993. His 1997 film, Boudiam, was selected for the Quinzaine des Réalisateurs, at Cannes Film Festival, and went on to win the grand prize at FESPACO. Gaston is also the founder of Imagine, a film training center in Ouagadougou that offers residencies and workshops for African artists. Okay, I will also introduce and have to thank our two great friends who have joined us for this first webinar. Somebody who I've also collaborated with on a number of occasions. Professor Lindiwe Dovey is a professor of film and screen studies at SOAS University of London, where she has been on the faculty since 2007. From 2019 to 2024, she is principal investigator of the ERC-funded project, African Screen Worlds, Decolonizing Film and Screen Studies project, which has brought together an international team, partners and participants to try to make screen studies and the film industry more globally representative and equitable by centering African filmmaking and through creative, scholarly, and activist work. Originally from South Africa, Lindiwe has authored 2 acclaimed books, African Film and Literature, Adapting Violence to the Screen, 2009, and Curating Africa in the Age of Film Festivals, 2015, and many articles on African filmmaking, and also co-funded, directed, and curated 2 of the most important African film festivals in the UK, Film Africa and the Cambridge African Film Festival. So we are indeed in great company. Another one, another distinguished panelist is Mamadou Diouf. Mamadou teaches African studies and history at Columbia University in the School of Arts and Science in the USA. He is Leitner Family Professor of African Studies, Middle Eastern, Southern Asian, and African Studies Department, and History in the History Department. He previously served at the University of Michigan between 2000 and 2007, and Kodisra and Cheikh Anta Diop University in Senegal. His more recent publications include the following edited books: Déborder, La Négritude, Arts, Politique, Art Politique et Société à Dakar, Arts, Politics and Society in Dakar, with Maureen Murphy in 2020. The Arts of Citizenship in Africa, Spaces of Belonging, with R. Fredericks in 2015. Les Arts de la Citoyenneté au Sénégal as well. Espace Contesté et Civilité Urbaine with F. Fredericks in 2013. Tolerance, Democracy and Sufis in Senegal, 2013. Rhythms of the Afro-Atlantic, Rituals and Remembrances with I. Nwankwo in 2010. And New Perspectives on Islam in Senegal, Conversion, Migration, Wealth, Power, and Femininity with Mara Lightman, 2009. So thank you all. We're so happy that you're here to join us and to participate and to share your knowledge with us. Thank you. I will now pass you over to Gaston Cabouret, I've just checking on his visual presence here. So we may do a little swap to make that possible.
Yes, while we're waiting for June, I would just remind participants that the films are available for streaming, and they will be available, I think, until maybe midnight tonight. And each week they will be available about 3 or so days before. There is also on the website information an additional list of films which we recommend for additional viewing, independent viewing. I think, as Salah and others have said a few minutes ago, accessing African cinema, at least of the past, on distribution on screen is not always easy, but we hope you'll be able to locate these titles or at least note them for further reference. We know that things are changing or have changed a little bit in the last maybe 2, 3 years, 5 years, perhaps not very long, but it can be added to your own list of preferences and discoveries, in fact, yeah. So I hope you'll be able to look at as many as possible in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Dr. June Giovanni, as well, for the wonderful, warm introduction. It's so lovely to be collaborating with you again and with the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. Hello and greetings to everyone who's joined us on a Saturday afternoon to be discussing African cinema together, something we all feel so passionately about. And thank you to everyone who's organized the webinar today, Dr. June Giovanni, Dr. Imru Bakari, everyone at the Africa Institute at Sharjah, Professor Hassan, and also Reem El-Badawi and Satan Al-Hassan, who've done so much behind the scenes to put this together. So thank you very much. And of course, to our very honored moderator, Gaston Cabouret. I'm so privileged to be given an opportunity today to speak on this panel and alongside Professor Mamadou Diouf, and to really talk about ideas around African cinema. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment, I'm going to share my screen with you all because I do have some slides for this presentation. Okay, so I hope you can all see my slides. So where I'd like to just start my reflections is on, this curatorial approach to African film, which has been really central to my own scholarship and running of film festivals, and really inspired by June Giovanni and her foundational work as a curator of African cinema as well. We've already heard about the importance of African films being accessible, particularly to audiences in Africa, to students of African cinema in Africa. And this question arises through a curatorial approach as well, about what story is being told through which films we restore, curate, teach, canonize, and bring together to discuss. And of course, with the webinar today, we can ask then what story emerges through watching these 3 assigned films, Afrique sur scène, Le Retour d'un Aventurier, and Alad. And also what is perhaps not told by this story. So, I feel that watching these films together gives a wonderful sense of the diversity of the early days of African filmmaking. But we can also complement these films by looking to some other foundational books, scholarship, films and ideas. And I want to highlight here a book that was co-edited by Imru Bakari with Imbai Cham, African Experiences of Cinema, which was really foundational to my own learning about African cinema. And partly because this was the first book, to my knowledge, that reprinted many of the early manifestos written by African filmmakers, created at meetings in Algiers, in Miami, in Ouagadougou, and in Harare. And, this gives a strong sense of how African cinema was born at that moment of political liberation that Africans had been fighting for in so many nations in the 1960s, and that many African countries were still fighting for in Angola, in Mozambique, in South Africa, and in Zimbabwe. And I wanted to quote Gaston Cabaret here from his introduction to a recent special issue of Black Camera Journal, where he says, cinema is not only entertainment, but more important and fundamental. It's a tool to develop consciousness and foster a renaissance among Africans from their own perspectives and lived experiences. Along with looking to these manifestos and to that sense of African film being a cinema born out of manifestos and out of the need for political liberation, we also need to look at how African film practices were really born at film festivals that were founded on the African continent. And this has preoccupied me a lot in my own scholarship, as in my most recent book, Curating Africa in the Age of Film Festivals. And the two most important film festivals to mention here are the Carthage Film Festival, which was founded in Tunisia in 1966 by Taha Sharia, and then FESPACO in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, where June and Gaston are currently sitting and which is celebrating its closing ceremony as we speak today. And the FESPACO has been covered in huge comprehensive detail in this special edition of Black Camera that Gaston Cabaret and Michael Martin edited and which came out last year. You can see how voluminous this special edition is, and it brings together pieces that had already been written about FESPACO, as well as newly commissioned work to speak about the vital importance of this festival to the birth of African filmmaking and to ongoing contemporary African filmmaking practices. If we compare, what these two film festivals have done for African filmmaking with the insights from Claire Andrade Watkins' very important piece, France's Bureau of Cinema, Financial and Technical Assistance, we see how African countries had to reclaim their agency and autonomy from European colonialists, because the French set up the Bureau of African Cinema in 1961 and started funding many of the African films that were made up until 1977. And you can imagine the kinds of strings that were attached to some of this funding and other problematic practices, such as buying the non-commercial rights to African films to show African films in only French cultural centers on the continent, thereby de-economizing African cinema and not allowing it to meet African audiences. I also want to highlight here, though, that many African filmmakers and African scholars have, pointed to how diverse African filmmaking is and the birth of African filmmaking is. So they point out that this was not only a cinema born out of politics, but we have to look at, the cinema in all its complexity and all of its nuance. And here I would point you to a really interesting piece by the Congolese filmmaker Mwezi Ngangura, again in Imru and in Bai Cham's book, called African Cinema, Militancy or Entertainment, which looks also at the vital, role that African filmmakers have tried to play in bringing enjoyment and entertainment to African audiences through their films. And also the Cameroonian film scholar Lexi Chuap has written a very interesting book, Post-Nationalist African Cinemas, which he published in 2013, which revisits many of the early African films and looks for the comedy and the humor and the entertainment value in these early films to show how nuanced they are. So I just wanted to highlight these tensions and just to say that we should consider this in relation to the three assigned films for this webinar, perhaps especially Mustafa Alassan's films, including his short satirical animated film Bon Voyage Sim, and also in relation to the further viewings for this week. And I guess my key point here is that we really need to pay attention to multiple African filmmakers' work and to the complexity of these filmmakers' work politically and aesthetically to really get the full breadth of experience of African cinema. Now, I'd just like to come on to some of the pioneers of African filmmaking beyond those people whose films have been assigned for today, Vieira and Alassan and Shaheen. So we, of course, cannot not mention Ousmane Sembène, the Senegalese writer and filmmaker. And sorry, I couldn't resist including this photo of me with Sembène, which was taken in London at an event that June Giovanni organized with Keith Shiri. I think it was in 2005 at the Barbican. Sahrawan, a wonderful event. And, you know, Sembène was often referred to and has been referred to as the father of African cinema. He was a committed anti-colonialist, Marxist, and very importantly, feminist. This is something I wanted to highlight that I've written about, the feminist and womanist basis to much of early African cinema by male African filmmakers. And if you look at what, for example, French male filmmakers were doing at the same time in the 1960s, you can see just how feminist these African filmmakers were. I also wanted to highlight, because of our discussions today, that Sembène and many of the early African filmmakers did study in Moscow, in the Soviet Union. And so they're interesting influences from Soviet cinema on African cinema and vice versa. Other foundational figures that I just wanted to highlight, and there are too many people to mention, but these are some other people I would like to highlight, is Ilala Ipsa from Ethiopia, who was the first to make a feature film in Ethiopia that was actually in an African language, in Amharic. And often Mandabi by Sembène from 1968 is called the first African film in an African language. But actually, as my colleague Michael Thomas has told me, Hirut, made in 1964, came before Mandabi. Taha Sharia from Tunisia, who was not a filmmaker, but a founding member of FEPASI, the Federation of African Filmmakers, which Gaston Cabaret directed for 12 years. And Taha Sharia was also the founder of the Carthage Film Festival, had a very close personal relationship to Sembène. There's a beautiful documentary about him by Mohammed Shoulouf. Lionel Ngakani should be mentioned too as the father of South African cinema. He came to the UK from South Africa because of apartheid. He had to come in exile. And he made a beautiful short film here in the UK called Jemima and Johnny, about the friendship between a young black girl and a young white boy that you can watch on the BFI player. Safi Faye as the first Black African woman to make a feature-length film in Africa, the beautiful Kadu Baikat, A Letter to My Village, which is a very elegant docu-fiction film. And then Sarah Mulderer, who in my view is one of the most Pan-African of filmmakers. She grew up in France, her parents were Guadeloupean. She studied in Moscow with Sembène. You can see her here in the photograph with Sembène. And she made films in lots of different African countries at the time of political liberation and where countries were still fighting for their liberation, for example, in Angola and in Algeria. And I just want to pause on her work because it's sometimes the pioneering African women filmmakers aren't given as much attention as the men. And her film Sambizanga, which we've screened at festivals I've run in Cambridge and London, was actually made at the height of the war, the liberation war in Angola. It had to be filmed in the Congo because of the war. And I just think she was so courageous in making this very important film. I also think it's sad that full attention to her work is only being given now, sadly, after her passing in 2020. But it is great that this revival of her work is underway. Her film Sambizanga has been restored by the World Cinema Foundation and FEPASI, and recently screened at the London Film Festival. And also I wanted to highlight, for those of you who may be in Paris or able to get to Paris, there's going to be a major exhibition of Sarah Mulderer's work launching at the Palais de Tokyo in November and running through to March, that really situates her work within tricontinental cinema, but also puts it in conversation with the work of younger filmmakers whose work she's inspired. Now, very briefly, just to wrap up, I also did want to highlight the work of one of the assigned filmmakers today, who I've written a little bit about, Poulan Soumounou Vieira, who was from Benin and Senegal. And he was one of the collective that called themselves the African Filmmakers Group that created this film that you've hopefully watched for today, Afrique sur Scène, made in Paris in 1955, and often called the first film made by sub-Saharan African filmmakers. But there's some context here that is very important to know. Vieira was the first African to study at and graduate from the prestigious French film school IDHEC, which is called FEMIS today. And after graduating, he really wanted to make a film in Senegal. But at the time, France had a law in place called the Laval Decree, which stipulated that any African filmmakers who wanted to make a film in Africa had to submit the script to them for approval. And this committee rejected Vieira's proposal to make a film in Senegal. And this is one of the reasons why this film had to be made in Paris. Now, a lot of film scholars have talked about how the images in Afrique sur scène can seem like they're quite conciliatory between, showing happy relationships between Africans and the French. But a former PhD student of mine, Kate Bolger-Smith, has written an excellent chapter on Afrique sur scène that unfortunately unpublished, but that really pays attention to the soundtracks of this film and shows how they're hidden transcripts and very subversive tendencies in the sound used, in the particular music tracks chosen, that provided a subversive critique that perhaps wasn't possible because of the constraints that Vieira was working under. And while we're talking about the importance of sound in African film, I just wanted to highlight these two books as well. One about Mambati's films and the vital importance of sound in his films. And then also the new book, Sound Senses, which has just been published and looks at soundtracks in several African films. Also just want to suggest that in addition to looking at the subversive potential of the soundtrack in Afrique sur scène, by placing this film alongside several other films, a different kind of narrative can be told as well. One that shows a kind of trajectory in which African filmmakers became more empowered to become more vocal in their critique of the treatment of Africans in France and of colonialism. So one sees then moving from Afrique sur scène to Le Noir de au Black Girl in 1966, Semben's profound and heartbreaking film based on a true story and partly set in Antibes that deals with the terrible treatment of a Senegalese domestic worker by her white French bosses. And then we can move on to Mauritanian filmmaker Med Hondo's film Soleil, made in 1969. And you can just, about an African immigrant in Paris and his terrible treatment. And you can see in this poster, the rage that comes out at this horrendous treatment. Before closing, it would be remiss of me not to also mention that Vieira, in addition to being a filmmaker and a FIPASI member, was also a film scholar. He was one of the first people writing books about cinema and African cinema. He traveled widely and documented African films and filmmakers' presence at film festivals. And he wrote these books in French. And sadly, they haven't been translated into English. I have my copies. I found them at the Présence Africaine bookstore in Paris. And this really shows the Anglophone bias in our field, I think, as well. And, these books should be translated into lots of different languages to give a richer sense of what was happening in the early days of African cinema. Just finally, in the way that Vieira mixed scholarship with filmmaking and curation and other kinds of film practice, he started a kind of movement that is very prevalent in African film circles, where many African film scholars are also making films or also working as curators. So I just wanted to highlight three people here: Betty Ellison, who's done an amazing amount of work on African women filmmakers, Manthia Diawara, and Samba Gajigo, who has made a wonderful documentary about Semben. Finally, just a slide here sharing with you some of the articles that I've written in which I elaborate on the points that I've made in this presentation. So I will stop sharing there, and thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm sorry for running a little bit over my allotted time.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lindiwe. That was a very, very full and rich presentation. It covered a lot of ground in a great and succinct way. So we're very pleased for that, and I'm sure it will generate a lot of comment from the people that are attending, and I'm sure it will also dovetail well with Mamadou Diouf's presentation, which is what we will move to now. Gaston has asked me to help a little bit, but he will be back on here as well as we go forward. But thank you very much for that. And it's packed with memories, of course, for all of us. So I think it'll be a rich discussion. Thank you, Lindiwe. And Professor Mamadou Diouf, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, June. I would like to thank the Institute, June's organization, and IMU for associating me to this very important discussion. I would like also to thank Gaston, who, despite being sick, decided to come. And I'm sure that he's going to be an important voice in this discussion, because not only has he been and he is still a filmmaker, he has been also somebody reflecting and acting on African cinema as a political actor, but also as an aesthetic actor, which is actually an illustration of the kind of trajectory of African cinema and ways in which, filmmakers have been imagining what it means. And my presentation will deal on looking at the voices, trying to extract those voices from actually the discussion about cinema, in particular at the beginning of film production. And I think that the field has been changing, and the debate is being reframed, as I think June mentioned, basically because of the intensification of the work, of restoring and archiving. The kind of, if you want, quote unquote, discovery of what has been done. And one of the most interesting and probably pleasant question is the question of what is, or which movie is the first movie? Indicate the beginning. Which region, which actually country this, the production of movies began in Africa, is why the tension, and Lindiwe talked about, is a tension basically between, in particular at the beginning, between African cinema and cinema in Africa. And that tension is already present in the first papers of Paulin Vieira, who is asking really that question, the question of African cinema. So I'm interested in that, in what is changing, what is being reframed about production, about distribution, about reception of film on Africa, which are film produced by non-African on Africa, and African film, which are supposedly indigenous, which are supposedly African production of images and sound about Africa and African communities. And I think that one question which is important raised by Lindiwe is about interpreting those first African films. And are they dialogical? I will say that instead of saying, are they conciliatory? Are they part of the empire assimilation packaging? Or are they conflictual? Let's say, and the kind of couple we can mention is, on one hand, watching Vieira, on the other watching Sembe. About, or are there just, movies which are trying to advocate redressing the situation, repairing, the damages done by ethnographic, ethnological interpretation. So I think that the tensions which are being reopened opened by actually preservation, archiving, and restoration are interesting because they are allowing us to deeper into actually the critical question. And, you know, my presentation is precisely influenced by that. One, I am a historian, and what I'm interested in mostly is using, you know, the visual documentation as an archive for interpretation. And the impact of images has been considerable. And in, you know, as a Senegalese historian, my experience has been shaped by Sembène's Chedo and the discussion about the historicity of the movie and the kind of very difficult engagement between Sembène on one hand and historians on the other, which went beyond, and this is the important aspect for me, which went beyond, you know, a film. It opened up a discussion about history and history production in Senegal. Sembène, who had a kind of disdain for academic historian, actually said that historians were chronophages. They were unable actually to produce, if you want, in an acceptable language, an interpretation which actually preserve the uncertainty of history. Instead of linearity, Sembène was interested in telescoping temporalities. Why is it important? It's important because I think that the foundations of African cinema were referred to the idea that it should subvert, if you want, what Mudimbe called the colonial library. It should come not only with new images, but it should come with a language, and the language should be a pedagogical language. It's why Sembène say that cinema is a night school. It's this marginal system which goes after the formal system. And this is very important in actually understanding ways in which the past and the present are engaging each other to create new modalities, to basically open a new moment, to create new events. And the creation of new events is important. And here, one important aspect to keep in mind is the kind of evolution which is both a parallel and oppositional evolution between cinema and literature. And the fact that, you know, it's about, at a critical moment, actors which are trying to find the appropriate language to engage a conversation with the African masses. And in some cases, to engage the conversation with, you know, the empire, and try to figure out ways in which they can, this is also, I think, an important element. They try to contribute to this new universal civilization Senghor is talking about, but to also this meeting of the giving and the receiving Césaire talks about. And it's interesting in this, looking at that tension, looking at the pedagogical aspect, but also at the political and psychological aspect, to compare, you know, Sembène's let's say, Borom Saret and Ababakar Sam et la neige n'était plus. These are also very foundational. Ababakar Sam, which is more psychology. I don't think that you have a kind of continuity, with some cinema, which, actually some critics are looking as a filmmaker influenced by Fanon, one of the rare filmmakers that deal with that. And I think that if we want to understand much better the moment, the event of cinema becoming one of the art important politically for mostly in the Francophone world, people who were engaged in the negritude movement, but people who were engaged also in the Communist Party, we have to look at the importance and the production of présence africaine, which is both, if you want, a theoretical production, but which is also a kind of material production. Présence africaine actually produced the film of René and Chris Marker, which is Les statues meurent aussi. And I think it's important. And we have also to mention, a paper which is very important, which is overlooked, but it's one of probably the most important paper which is writing the history of the engagement, of the generation, nationalist, quote unquote, generation with cinema, and the importance of cinema for them and why it's important. It's a paper by Kalalobe, Iwiye Kalalobe, which is published in 1983, which is quite a complete paper on, the title is Alioune Diop and African Cinema. Alioune Diop et le cinéma africain. And he just traces the history, the genealogy of African cinema. Very quickly, Lindiwe talked about that, and I mentioned it in my opening remark, is all this discussion about the beginning of African cinema, where, when. And the first question it raises is, do we have to introduce North Africa and Egypt into this discussion, or do we need to keep them outside? And this discussion is important because it changes our chronology. We talk mostly about the end of World War II. But if we consider the continent as a whole, we were obliged to go, in the 1920s, which means that Africans are at least, or part of Africa is at least engaged in cinema practices a few years after the invention of cinema in the West. And this could have an interesting aspect. But further element I'm interested in talking about very quickly is what is the qualifier African means when we discuss African cinema. Is it about African cinema? Is it about cinema, plural, of Africa, which is what Vieira uses, or is about cinema, singular, in Africa? So what is the meaning of the geographical, the racial, the ethnic markers? What mission the first generation of filmmakers assigned themselves? And for that, Lindiwe has talked about the writing of Vieira on the political economy, the aesthetic, and the theme of African cinema. He deals also with the history of colonial legislation on images, which is something which is part of colonial governance. I think the first decree in the West African colonial empire of the French is William Ponty in the context of a preparation of World War I, you know, banning votive religious images from the East, you know, in order to what he called contain any Islamist, you know, mobilization supporting the Ottoman Empire. She mentioned, Lindy, we mentioned the Laval Decree of 1934, but you have also at the same time, you know, the decree is actually enforced until 1961, I think. And the interesting aspect is it didn't allow Vieira to shoot his movie, but the French decided in the 50s to send Vautier. And Vautier subverted his project, Africa 1950. But you have also in 1961, the end of the Laval Decree, the creation of the Bureau du Cinéma to assist African filmmakers. So, and I already mentioned Kalalobe's paper, which gives us a very interesting sense of the history. And very quickly, it's important to really trace that history and how actually African intellectual, African activists, African writers were really involved in the creation of an African cinema. And the first manifestation is actually the first Congress, the second Congress of the African Black intellectual and artists in Rome in 1959. Because in 1959, a resolution was adopted by the Arts Commission, which was set by Alun Diop within the African Society of Culture. He has created following the creation of Présence Africaine. I would have been, I don't want, because it's too long, it will be interesting to read actually the resolution, which first talk about, you know, the long domination of foreign powers, you know, of African communities, and the new moment, the road to independence, and why cinema has to contribute, why colonial cinema has contributed to the devitalization of the indigenous culture of Black Africa, and has been an instrument of propaganda and indoctrination, often unfavorable to the self-esteem and national pride of African people. So it's a reaction. Cinema is important because it was an instrument of domination. It has to be deconstructed, and Africans have to come up with their own visual and sonic actually comment. And it's what they call the constructive use of image. The second moment is the creation of, as I say, these subcommittees within the art committee. In 1960, it was decided to detach the subcommittee, the cinema subcommittee, and turn it into a committee to show you how important cinema was. It's the only subcommittee which became a committee. And the creation of such a committee is important because it's already indicate, if you want, one of the founding fathers of African cinema, because they are part of this committee set up by Alun Diop. You have well-known Baba Tunde from Nigeria, you have Amadou Sakho from Guinea, Felix Ewande, and Mukori from Cameroon, Mustafa Al-Hassan, which you have, many of you have probably seen his movie, from Niger. You have Semben, you have Vieira, you have Blaise Senghor, you have Yves Diagne, Ababakar Sam, Timothy Basori. And that list is interesting because it allows you to follow the career of these people who disappear, and people who remain in the fold of culture, but not necessarily remaining filmmakers. So in '64 also is the creation of the Inter-African Film Commission to the UNESCO. And they publish a memorandum which is worth reading because it set up goals, aspiration, and talked about product. The goals is educational, social. It's also ethnographic, cultural, and sociological. The aspiration is education. The duty for African filmmaker to educate on all levels while entertaining African masses. And this tension between education, recreation, and political intervention remain very, very important. But fighting illiteracy through a kind of direct oral intervention is important. The products are also important. And here one interesting aspect is that this memorandum was translated into English and distributed all over Africa to government. And what Presence Africaine requested, in particular from ministers of education, is the list of Africa, the list of filmmakers in all the countries. So this, and you have the 65 also, which is very, very important, which is the conference of Gênes. So I am talking about that, and I will finish there, is to just show how cinema was critical for the nationalist group, and how at the end of the 50s and early 60s, you have an important intervention. That intervention is not only a discussion among Africans, but it's also an engagement between Africans and non-African engaged with working on Africa. You have people like Edgar Morin, Jean Rouch, etc. The Gênes conference is interesting because of also the fact that many movies were screened. And the movies screened are both fiction and actually fiction and documentary. I wanted to bring the voices of the actors to precisely finish by asking, the following question: is if their challenge was how to ensure an African presence on the world stage, looking at political manifestation as cosmopolitan engagement, and setting very clear mission. One question we have to ask after Imru and June is, was really African cinema decolonized? If the aim was to do that, and how do we look at the process of decolonization? And do we have still to talk about African cinema or national cinema? And when we talk about national cinema, do we have to include the production of the African diaspora? I'm thinking of Ayla Gerima, I am thinking of Alain Gomis, and I'm thinking of Mati Diop. So thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou.
Thank you very much, Mamadou. That's a great history as well that you've covered there, a very deep one. And it reminded me of a number of things. I mean, when we did the Semben Mambeti presentation at the New York Film Archive. And then we came to Colombia to discuss further around that as well. And I should also say that this year at FESPACO, Senegal is the country of honor here this year. But what is also interesting, and I think we have to bear in mind, is you know, the range that we're talking about for the continent. And I think that was why we had the Shaheen film also within the context of some of the films that are at the founding basis of African cinema. And those are some of the things that I'd like to comment on. We do also have here quite an important film about Fanon. It's called Fanon Yesterday and Today. Low budget film, but quite an important film that also covers this idea of the importance of cinema in the whole development and challenge against domination. I will pass over to Imru at the moment, who will take this discussion on further. Thank you, Imru.
Yes, thank you, June. And I'm going to take over in view of support for Gaston Kabore. Yes?
Sorry, can I just ask, I wanted to, oh, it's okay, I shouldn't have bothered you, I'll put it on the chat, to encourage the people that—
Yes, I'm going to ask the participants to put their questions in the chat, because we are, of course, aware of time, but we need to get some involvement. I've seen 1 or 2 questions already, which
Q&A.
I will put to the panelists. And I just want to thank Mamadou Diop and Lindiwe Dove for the both great and very in-depth presentations. And in fact, the scope they've managed to cover in the short time, and of course it is a short time, is phenomenal. And it reinforces what Lindiwe has said about the diversity and the complexity of the subject of African cinema, or even if we extend it to suggest Pan-African cinema. Mamadou Diop is speaking, of course, from the point of view of a historian, and his notion about the genealogy of an African cinema, I think, is a key point of intervention when we begin to teach African cinema or consider its criticality and its text, its various texts. In fact, he ended up by suggesting that African cinema didn't take place in a vacuum. There was a number of world issues and events and movements, whether they emanated from African communities or individuals, or from, as we know, term it, the empire, right? Now, the issue of national cinema also is a very important question, particularly as it relates to the question of cinema in Africa and African cinema. These are 2 important different distinctions, which are important for us to understand the field which we are engaged with. We make, for our own pedagogical and you might say ideological approach, we don't make a distinction between North or separate North Africa from what is assumed to be south of the Sahara, right? We know that Africa is a continent of regions, North, East, South, West, and Central, for practical purposes. And we know all of these have had different experiences of African cinema, whether it be colonial or otherwise. And what we are trying to do is to locate this activity as a dynamic across the continent and globally. And therefore, I would just want to ask, Mamadou Diop has said he's speaking from the point of view of a historian. Just a little bit in response to that, Lindiwe, just where you are speaking from, so that we can at least provide some points of convergence for the kind of discussions which have been opened up so far. What would you say your position of engagement would be from?
Thank you so much, Imru. Such an important question there. And it's something that I've been reflecting on a lot over the last 6 years and that I've written about recently. I mean, I come to this in a disciplinary sense from film studies, but for me, including our personal positionality and lived experiences in our the sense of what perspectives we bring, how we interpret things is absolutely vital. So for me, being a white South African is very important to foreground. And I've published a piece on this in PAS, the PAS online journal recently, looking at what made me passionate about African film in the first place, falling in love with Soliman Sise's Yilin initially, feeling very angry that as a child growing up in apartheid South Africa, we didn't have access to films from the rest of the continent. Becoming passionate about African cinema, but being very humble about my own, compromised positionality as a white South African, and all the complications around, how we define continental African cinema when we have these diverse histories. I mean, the whole situation of South Africa presents very important debates about, race in that context in Zimbabwe as well. So I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at, Imru, but I just wanted to share that.
That's important, and it important locates your position within the, let's say, according to academia, within the field of cinema studies, which is quite a very specific interdisciplinary approach, right? So we can see how Mamadou, coming from a historian perspective, we can begin to understand where the ideas converge and what they open up in that convergence. Now, in the chat, I just want to go to some of the comments. There was someone who wanted to speak about silent African cinema. I don't know if the panelists want to talk about that specifically, but I would summarize that by saying cinema arrived in Africa within 5 years, or 3 or 4 years of its invention in 1895. By 1900, a lot of centers in Africa had seen or experienced cinema in one way or another. And we can then begin to chart in the genealogy how the making of films began in, as it were, in places like Egypt, for example, or South Africa, for example, but also how those cinema screens or cinema eyes across Africa encountered cinema. Now, I wanted to just, in view of that complex history, I'll just put a question out, another question, which helps us maybe to elaborate a little briefly, but elaborate, no doubt, on what you both have said. A question says, do filmmakers have a responsibility to educate and inform audiences on realities of life in Africa for international and African audiences, and bring up critical conversations and dialogue? How would either of you respond to that from the perspectives which you have spoken just now? Let's start with Mamadou.
Thank you. I think if we read, what African filmmakers, but also African educators and politicians have been saying, if we read carefully the conversation, as I say, cinema became critical in their ways of actually imagining what are the resources which are necessary for African emancipation. It's not only deconstructing the colonial library, as Mudimbe calls it, it's also replacing it, but replacing it in a kind of way which is not necessarily advocating for a kind of cultural or political unity. I think many of these filmmakers, many of these politicians of the early period were insisting on the very fact that Africa is diverse and pluralism is critical. It's why the direction which were taken were different. I think they agreed on one thing. The image of Africa exposed by within empire is not the right one. They have to come up with they have to correct it. They have to redress it. But second very important element, and you see it, the discussion between Engelbert Wang, the Cameroonian, who had curated a lot of things, including who has been one of the critical actor in the Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres, says that, urbanization is going to hurt, all the process of producing and preserving oral tradition. Probably one way to save oral tradition is actually through cinema. And cinema will allow African to have a new space, a new instrument to do that. So they are not only fighting to preserve tradition, they are fighting to reinvent tradition in a new context. This is also something very important, and it's what I call the pedagogical. The pedagogical aspect is, on one hand, deconstructing, on the other, innovating. Transaction was actually, and cinema allowed that to do that. To basically feature people acting, people talking, people dancing. And it's precisely why they believed that that instrument provided, something which was critical in the way of education. The interesting thing about, the early films is that, again, still today, if you go to a movie theater in Africa, people are not only sitting and watching, they are part of the thing. I cannot imagine with these early movies without sound, how they did. Mm-hmm. But it will be interesting to document that, to try to figure out how did they do when they think that they should be part of what is going on on the screen.
That is, of course, part of the African experience of cinema, as you would put it. Lindiwe, to you.
Thank you, Professor Diouf. Just to build on some of those ideas, it's really about how we define education in the end. And I think, again, we have to look at that colonial moment and how the colonial film units try to emphasize their own view of pedagogy and education on the continent, felt Africans needed a moral education, wanted to show films at the Becky, the British Educational Cinema Experiment, about why Africans should drink tea and coffee, put their money in banks, and we see this. Has this really ended when we look at, aid funding that still comes into the continent and that has supported lots of the filmmaking, as you know very well, in East Africa? What happens to filmmakers there, where funding comes in and filmmakers are told time and time again to make films about the Rwandan genocide or about the use of mosquito nets. And, it's how do Africans extricate themselves from that kind of education and give their own visions of what education should be. And yes, Sembène, I think about how he turned from writing to filmmaking to try and enact a political education for Africans. Many Nollywood filmmakers talk about actually not making entertainment films, but offering a form of moral education through their films. But the critical thing is the African autonomy and agency here and what that means. And film schools are obviously so vital to this. So again, Gaston's Imagine Film School on the continent, trying to create an Afrocentric form of film education. I mean, if we look at the international film schools around the world, and I've taken courses at several of them, I won't mention any names, but it is so Eurocentric still. They are still teaching Robert McKee's story, 3-act structure. And these are to very diverse student groups that sometimes include Africans. So that for me is the really important question. And as Professor Diouf was saying, the question is, has African cinema been decolonized? We need to look across all these elements of education, of where the funding is coming from, who's distributing the films, what platforms are they on, how are they being viewed as well. And of course, the viewers can resist. Let's not forget Manthia Diawara's idea of resistant spectatorship. So if there are forms of education being, Africans are being pummeled with forms of education that they don't like, they are, capable of resisting that through, laughing at the screen, chatting to one another, resisting those. So there's that interplay between the screen and audiences is also a very important political space.
Thank you. We have some important comments coming in, which I will go to because some of them echo one or two of the questions I may have wanted to follow up with. And there is a question here from Judith Del Rio, which says, I'd be interested in your opinions about the similarities, if you consider there are any, between the first African films of the 1960s. And of course, we are in a way contesting whether those were in fact the first African films, as an identity building tool, and how current film practices can build anti-racism and liberation, something along the lines of film as revolutionary practice. So could you both just hold that question in a minute for a comment? There's one here, follow up to Mamadou's closing question. Can we really speak of decolonization if our goal is to appeal to a cosmopolitan, often neoliberal gaze? And of course, they are thinking of theorists such as Glissant, Edouard Glissant's work, and no doubt the conditions within, let's say, what might be termed Francophone Africa and its influence on Africa. There's another question here from Morgana Gamba de Lima. You mentioned the importance of filmmakers' performance, the manifestos, festivals. I would like to know how do you see these, the importance of these, and specialized magazines, of course, current magazines, Cinema Action, Africa Screens, Écran d'Afrique, in creating a possible historiography about African cinema. We could start with Mamadou, or you want to pick up on that one about historiography, and then generally we'll see if we can respond to the other two comments as we go along.
Yeah, thank you. I think the first question about the relationship between the early cinema and what is happening. I was thinking of Alain Gomis or Mati Diop's movie, and seeing a kind of continuity about the question, which are one, the question about what is cinema and why are we producing these images, and the other for what and for who.
That is the subject of the fourth symposium.
Absolutely. I'm not going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to see the continuity and the fact that we have today, and I think Imru, you have showed it with by Cham, you have a real library of African films. And they are different, they are diverse, they are, et cetera. But the questions are still the same question. Is it possible to come up with a cinematographic language which is African? The way we talk about Hollywood, whatever we put, or today the question of Nollywood, we think that Nollywood has a specific identity. What does it mean in relation to the first manifestation is important. And this is why I was saying we have always to pay attention to literature. It's also a discussion which is raised in particular by a novel published by the Ivorian writer Bernard Daguier. And it's called Clembier. And what is interesting is the kind of question he's asking himself. He says, guess what? Europeans are saying that we are illiterate, but they don't want to create libraries in Africa. We have to go and read all the books because we are at a crossroad. And this is the other important thing for filmmakers. they are able to show why we are in a crossroad and what are the challenges we are facing. Is why some of them are conciliatory, like, you know, novelists. If you compare, let's say, Daye with Ousmane Socé Diop, who is from my hometown, it's very different. Socé Diop is for assimilation. But at the same time, again, if we move towards what you were calling the gaze and glissant and decolonization, I will go back again to literature. When I was young, I read this book by Kamara Lai, everybody knows, L'Enfant Noir, who is his big, you know, his bestseller.
The African Child.
Yeah, and I also read his Regard du Roi, The Radiance of the King. And for years, for me, you know, Kamara Lai was part of the, you know, conservative. He was more a kind of conciliatory than a revolutionary. And 2 years ago, I bought this translation of the Regard du Roi. And the amazing thing is that it is introduced by Toni Morrison. And Toni Morrison says, this is the greatest book ever written by an African. I say, wow, this is amazing, you know. And what she says is how he returned the gaze of the white man and how he makes the white man exist only through the gaze of the king, le regard du roi. And he uses the language of, you know, anthropologists and ethnologists. He just turned it upside down. And I think this is also something we have to keep in mind, that this kind of decolonization revolution is not necessarily a straight language. We have to go beyond that. I think Lindiwe gave the example of how listening to the sound could allow us to see how the deconstructive process is put together in some of these interventions, is where the performance is important to have an impact. I think what made Sembène is not only his movies and the greatness of his movies, is the way he acts in those movies, the way he's there. And he goes back and forth, but it's also the way his posture. It's someone I knew very well who had always refused to discuss his movies with me, saying, okay, go and watch them and do whatever you want. I have nothing to tell you. And I think this is a kind of how actually his intervention is basically an intervention in a conversation. We are again back to the pedagogical, but I think that the most important thing for us as scholars, in particular for scholars of movies and visual art, is to pay attention to the multiple voices which are part of one thing which is still going on, which is a conversation on the African presence on a stage, which is the world stage, being of cinema, of history, or whatever.
Thank you. Thanks, Lindiwe.
Thanks, Imru. Can I turn to the question that was about making the links between films made in the 1960s and then the current moment, the contemporary, and it was about, you know, whether the revolutionary potential of those films coming through. But in my answer, I also just want to come back to what Professor Diop was saying about, you know, can we find a cinematographic language that is African? Because I think, you know, in the way you and June have framed this series as well, it's, I think it was mentioned somewhere that African filmmakers are citing other African filmmakers more and more in their films as African films become more accessible. And to me, this is really exciting because that is what is going to produce, you know, diverse and alternative African and Afrocentric cinematographic cultures. We don't want to, in my view, have an either-or situation where African filmmakers aren't allowed to reference other films. As I said before, African filmmakers trained in the Soviet Union are in conversation again with those films. Cameron Bailey, the director of the Toronto Film Festival, has said, if you want to be a filmmaker, you've got to be watching films from all over the world. Inuhiko, who's a Japanese film scholar, has spoken about how we need to analyze films both in terms of their local, in the case of Japanese films, local Japanese culture, but also in the broader history of cinematographic culture globally. So this is really exciting to me if African filmmakers are getting to access and watch earlier African films more. And again, in a curatorial impulse, I would say, trying to connect those early films to contemporary films. Films I would curate together would be Abderrahmane Sissako's Bamako, for example, with Mustafa Alassan's Le Retour, because for those of you who've seen Bamako, there's a playful sequence, a film within a film called Death in Timbuktu, starring Danny Glover, that plays again on that idea of what Tsitsi Jaji has called the Cassava Western, and how African filmmakers have played with and subverted, the Western genre in American film. But of course, Bamako, puts Africans in conversation with the IMF and the World Bank. It's an incredibly political and revolutionary film. If we think about Al Ard, the Egyptian film by Shaheen, I would love to see that programmed with the recent film from Lesotho by Mosese. This is a burial. This is not a burial. This is a resurrection. And also with Safi Fay's Une lettre paysanne, a letter to my village, because there's a very revolutionary story that could be told there across 50, 60 years about what's happening with neoliberal capitalism to rural people, the confiscation of their lands and their livelihoods, and then how people are resisting that. And then of course we have young revolutionary filmmakers all over the continent. Nadia Boumouche in Morocco, who made My Maxen and Me during the Arab Spring in Morocco, and young people using their phones. Filmmaking has been democratized now. Obviously there are problems with where our phones come from and all of that, media extraction, which is a whole nother debate, but young people are making films all the time on their phones, uploading them to YouTube, communicating with one another. So those voices, those conversations that Professor Diouf was talking about have taken on new valence and more, are more rapid today because of these new technologies.
Thank you very much. I think in view of the interest of time, and in view of the fact that a lot of what we've said in the last few minutes is going to be returned to over the next few weeks, I would take the liberty of saying we have maybe another 10 minutes or so before we wrap up. And thank you again for the participation from the chat and the comments. There are a number of things that have come out of this discussion, and I just want to, bring it to a close around maybe a sort of preliminary conclusion, as it were. One is the importance of cinema as a modern experience within the world, of which Africa is part of that modernity, whether others think so or not, whether we think so or not. And the fact that African cinema cannot be considered outside of other kinds of movements and realities, whether it be the colonial or empire impositions, whether it be the congresses of writers in Paris or Rome, whether it be Présence Africaine, for example, whether it be the OAU or the AU, the idea that this is a continental organization constituted of every state on the continent, which is important. The point, however, is, as we have seemed to be saying, and I'm just deducing across the two contributions, is when we take on board all the diversity and the complexity, we are not necessarily really contesting that or the making of films. What we are really interrogating is how this body of work is studied. How is it studied? How is it archived? How is it understood within the moment? And in view of that, I just wanted, as a very final statement, to go back to firstly Lindway and secondly Professor Diop, Mamadou Diop, to give just a very brief conclusion or brief concluding statement around the notion, as one writer on African cinema has put it, when he talks about not simply African cinema, but a Pan-African cinema, because that's another kind of discourse around the notion of African cinema. How can we situate this notion, this idea, in relation to what he refers to as Africa's need to reconquer its cultural and economic space? I hope that question is helpful in terms of bringing together what you've all said, but giving us a sort of provocation to go forward. Lindway.
Thank you, Imru. That's a huge question, and I think I'm going to just answer it by giving a very specific response, which is that
most welcome.
Yes, there needs to be Pan-African solidarity here, but in my position as a scholar, I think that African film scholarship also needs to be more firmly rooted on the African continent itself. And this is something we're trying to do through my African Screen Worlds project. We have an edited volume that'll be coming out in a couple of years, and it gathers lots of the early career scholars who are working sometimes under very difficult conditions with a lack of resources on the continent, writing incredible ground view studies of what's actually happening on the ground with African filmmaking in diverse contexts, from Nigeria to Ethiopia to South Africa to Uganda. And I'm really excited about this because, this is part of what I say about my own positionality as a white African too. I'm passionate about this field, but what I would like to see in the future is, I'd like to hear less of my own voice and more, also I've lived outside of the continent for 20 years. I'm excited about those new young voices on the continent who will be the bearers of the study of African filmmaking in the future, and who will also be tasked with educating those African scholars on the continent about what the cinema means. And of course, they're going to have to work in conjunction with archives on the continent. June's been doing tremendous work on this question of the repatriation of African films, of archives. Africans need more access to this, and we need this. We need these discourses to be heard in African voices.
Yes, Mamadou Diop.
Thank you. Well, whatever we think about Bollywood movies,
Nollywood movies.
Nollywood movies, they are responses to the crisis of African cinema. But they are not only responses to a crisis, they are one of the greatest artistic innovation in Africa. We have to stop thinking, when we talk about slavery, we talk about the violence of slavery, but we have to also talk about how Africans responded to such violence. And sometimes it's more important to deal with that while addressing the violence, of white governance. And I think the dialectic is precisely that, what is really happening in Africa, and how Africans have been busy, failing, succeeding, addressing these different moments and dealing with, and creating their own cultural space, which is not necessarily the space we think about, because we were raised in a kind of environment which is still a kind of, let's say, post-colonial environment. The environment which is actually emerging is no longer post-colonial. I think that the end of post-coloniality is not necessarily all this thing about decoloniality. It's the way in which today Africans are trying to figure out, their presence in the world is not going back to something which is behind them. It's projecting themselves in the future. And the projection in the future is precisely what is creating new ideas, new infrastructures, new emotions, and new ways of understanding self and reinventing your community and reinventing the world. And for me, as a scholar, one of the most important things I believe we should do, or I am participating in, is the creation of African humanities, which include actually cinema, but creating those African humanities will allow us to open up an African debate, but an African debate which is not limited to Africa, but the voice of Africa will be predominant. And I agree with Lindy Way. The only way you do it is to recreate the infrastructures which allows us to create those, those institutions, to create practices and to open up a conversation.
Thank you very much. And I think that is an ideal and very important point in which we can end this very important discussion. Again, we are speaking about the foundations of African cinema. And of course, what you have both said seems to suggest something which is fundamental to how Africans exist in the modern world. And indeed, the importance of cinema and the moving image as part of that existence. And if I might just leave it there as for contemplation, and thank you, Lindiwe Dovi, thank you, Mamadou Diop. Unfortunately, I think we've sort of lost June at the moment, and Gaston, but we will conclude, and I'll just hand over now to Satan Al-Hassan. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Emru, and thank you all for this very enlightening discussion. Thank you to Lindiwe and to Mamadou, and we wish Gaston the best of health and a speedy recovery. I think, as Emru said, we've lost June. The connection might have been bad. For next week's session, the title of the session is Cinema Cultures in Africa. The films will be made available for free streaming on the Africa Institute's website starting the 28th of October until the 30th. And on the 30th at 6 p.m. Gulf Standard Time, film producer Pedro Pimenta will moderate a discussion between filmmaker Jihan Al-Tahri and Dr. Jude Akudinobi. We hope that you join us, and registration links will be available tomorrow through the Africa Institute website and on social media channels for everyone to register and have reminders set to watch the films. Thank you all very much, and thank you. Good afternoon, good morning.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to all the participants for all your comments and questions.